Welcome to this special episode of The Sceptic with me, your host, Laurie Wastell. And today I'm going to be speaking to Professor Eric Kaufmann about his new book. Professor Kaufmann is the head of the Institute of Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. He's a member of the advisory board of the Free Speech Union and a senior fellow at the think tank Policy Exchange, where he played a key role in creating the government's Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which passed last year. He's the author of books including Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?, White Shift, and most recently, Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So welcome to The Sceptic, Eric.
Great to be here, Laurie.
Okay, so Eric, let's start at the beginning. So you've written about populism, you've written about demography, and now you're writing about woke. So can you just give us a general outline of what you're arguing here in Taboo in this, your new scholarly work?
Well, yeah, so it is a critical book on woke, so it adds to that growing literature of woke studies, we'll call it. But essentially, the question is, how did we get here? And I offer a somewhat different appraisal of that than some other writers, such as either Chris Rufo or Yascha Mounk on the one hand, or Richard Hanania and Chris Caldwell on the other. So my view is, first of all, that what we're seeing is an acceleration rather than some kind of new deviation from the West's intellectual trajectory. So it's that ideas that have been around, first of all, since the 60s, but actually with deeper roots that go into the beginning of the 20th century, those have accelerated. And so we're witnessing essentially layers of three different ideas. One is humanitarianism, sort of care for the weak, protection for the weak. The second being egalitarianism, equal outcomes. And the third being a version of liberalism that focuses on difference over commonality and change over tradition. So it's a fusion of those sorts of three sets of ideas. But it's really been accelerating since the late 60s, in particular because of the rise of the anti-racism taboo, which is kind of core to my argument that the anti-racism taboo, which comes in force in polite society in the mid-1960s in the U.S., is kind of like the Big Bang of our moral universe. And everything since, you can almost separate history into a before the Big Bang and after the Big Bang. And what we're living through is, in some ways, as our universe is, it's a sort of outworking of the logic of that seismic event. Now it's going to start more in Berkeley and in East London, the Greater London Council, and in the Toronto District School Board. These kind of centers of radicalism are places where this is going to get more of a foothold earlier. And so actually you won't see much change if you go into those radical epicenters. There's not really, the language is different. You won't notice that much change. It's the people who were in, for example, math and science departments, and suddenly they're getting decolonized. Yes, that's new. So in many places, this is new, and people think, therefore, that it's something new, but I'm arguing it isn't really new. It's actually got decades and decades of heft behind it. So that's one argument, is this is not new, and also for that reason, it's not going to fade. This argument that we're at peak woke, it's fading away the way McCarthyism did, again, that's something that I disagree with, because this is really a feature, not a bug, of the Western moral order, as established by that anti-racism taboo, which created this sacredness and the tripwires around particular groups. And so that kind of gets me to the definition of woke in the book, and I'm very specific about this: making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. And so it is particular empathy for particular groups and the narrative around their oppression. That's what provides the meaning into the system. And it's also why you're going to get canceled for touching or offending even the most sensitive member of one of those groups. And that's where the tripwires are in the culture. And so you can actually trace the hypersensitivity around race, for example, back to the mid-60s. And there were even cancellations beginning in the mid-60s. The Moynihan report on the black family being the first cancellation, it was shelved in 1965 by the Johnson administration because it was seen as being too controversial. that is kind of the beginning of where we are. And then, so this idea of cancel culture is not new. It's just that it's more frequent. And that's the only difference. I mean, in the mid 2000s, there were 300 incidents of punishment for speech and cancellation recorded by fire. That's just 2008. So this is well before the great awakening of the mid 2010s. So that's just a bit of background. A lot of the book also talks about where we can go in terms of solutions. So it's not just saying this is a problem, but I just want to say that the main argument of the book is trying to make the claim that this is cultural, and a lot of it stems from the rise of the anti-racism taboo, which then gets stretched sideways to become the anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia taboo. And these taboos and red lines really structure our moral system.
Right. Yeah. And so obviously woke is a term that people will hear a lot, these days, especially people who read the Daily Sceptic. It's in the news quite a lot, and it's often used as a polemical term. But this book, you really, you marshal a huge amount of quantitative social science evidence on the concept of woke. Can you just tell us a bit why it's important to sort of study it in an analytic and scientific way?
Well, just because it's very easy to tell a just so story based on anecdotes, although I still think anecdotes and qualitative evidence are powerful, but people can more easily dismiss them if they say, oh, well, that's just one professor being fired, and that's an isolated incident, or it's just a handful of incidents, and look at the 1 million, academics in the U.S., this is nothing. So part of the point of doing the survey evidence is to show just how deep-seated and pervasive these issues are. So when you find, for example, that only 1 in 5 conservative academics or 1 in 5 Republican academics in the U.S. would tell that to a colleague that they voted for the Republicans, that gives you a sense of how much self-censorship is going on. And so it's important, I think, to get these quantitative measures. The other thing is it shows a lot of the differences. So, for example, you can see that anyone who votes for a conservative party is overwhelmingly opposed to attacks on major historical figures. So the idea of removing Winston Churchill's statue is strongly opposed by 70% of conservative voters. The idea of teaching that the U.S. is a racist country is strongly opposed by almost 100% of Republican voters. It's just important, whereas if you take Democratic voters, they're very sort of split and divided on these issues. It's important to show that public opinion, to show that the public is 2/3 anti-woke across, say, 50 questions. That's the U.S., Canada, and British publics. So if this is where the public is, then, it's not. Whereas if you were just to track discourse in the elite press, you would actually not get that sort of picture. You kind of sense there's really two sides and they're equally matched. The other thing, of course, is the youth question, which we may get into later, and just to see how much more woke the younger generation is compared to anyone over 45 is really dramatic. And I think that's a big part of the argument of the book, is that we have this ticking time bomb of progressive illiberalism. And so any talk about woke being a fad and fading away has to reckon with the fact that the median voter and organizational leader in 20 years is going to be a Zoomer. And if you look at their attitudes, it's very hard to see how we avoid a shift into an increasingly intolerant culture.
Right. And so in terms of criticisms of wokeness, obviously you mentioned just so stories and anecdotes. What are some of the misconceptions about woke that people tend to labor under?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, one is, for example, that it depends. It is sort of it can be stretched. There's no question it can be used as an epithet, but I would argue that it has a clear core of beliefs. This idea of equality of outcome, no race or gender gaps, no gaps between black and white, between male and female, whether it be entrance to Harvard, whether it be CEOs, whatever the desired elite position is. And the second is this hypersensitivity. And so I think there are a lot of people who don't understand quite how extreme some of the attitudes are, particularly among young people, that sort of 3/4 to 90% don't even want to allow somebody on campus who, this is amongst elite students in the top 200 U.S. universities, someone who wants to come onto campus and say that, for example, trans is a mental disorder, you got 75 to 85% saying that person should not even be allowed to speak. So just the overwhelming power of this viewpoint amongst young people is one thing. But then on the other hand, of course, the fact that 2/3 of the public is pro-free speech and also generally against what I call deculturation, sort of tearing down statues and rewriting history books and erasing the past. So there's a real strong mandate in the population really to push back against the inroads that woke has made in our elite institutions. So it's partly making a point that there's a real democratic mandate for that.
Yeah. And so also in terms of misconceptions by people who are critical of woke, one of the ways it's often portrayed is as a sort of luxury belief, as a kind of virtue signaling, and one of the words that's used is preference falsification, so the idea that everyone is sort of going along with it, but they don't really believe in it. But I think you suggest from your work that that's not really quite right.
Yeah, so that's another important point, is that I think a lot of this is true belief rather than fear or just purely signaling one's status. As with support for right-wing populism, by the way, I just don't think there is much of a correlation with a person's income, whether they have a job or not, and status. Now, of course, status does come into it a little bit in the so far as if these beliefs are, if these have somehow become the moral center of society, this idea of equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for historically marginalized identity groups, if that becomes the be-all and end-all of morality at the elite level, then of course that is going to affect how people herd towards those beliefs. But one of my argument is that, for example, even on a survey where no one's looking over your shoulder, no one's actually looking over your shoulder. You can't virtue signal to anybody on a survey, and yet even on a survey, you have, for example, by a 2-to-1 margin, social science academics supporting mandatory diversity statements being, by a 60-40 margin, more in favor of fixed so-called decolonization, that is mandatory race and gender quotas on reading lists, than against it. So if you're trying to argue to me that, as some optimists have, that, actually the faculty really would love the freedom to not have to deal with decolonization and diversity statements. Unfortunately, the evidence is against that. The evidence suggests that most of them support this. And so the carrot, the appeal of being on the side of the underdog identity minority is very powerful in our culture, in our society. And that picks up sort of group which I call soft liberal or left liberal, which is the key group as far as I'm concerned. Not the radical cultural Marxist left, which, they have introduced critical race and gender ideology. However, the support for this stuff comes from that left liberal bleeding heart segment, which is 50 to 60% of the faculty in the social sciences and research universities. So that is a key group. And on a survey, they'll broadly support a lot of DEI measures like mandatory diversity statements. Even if you take people with a degree in the general public, almost half of them would support these kinds of measures around sensitivity and affirmative action, and on a survey. So I think, yes, fear plays a role. And so if you poll them and you say, there is I would say it's about 25% of the phenomenon which is fear-based, that you can pick that up on a survey. That is people who say, well, I oppose it, but I wouldn't raise my hand in a meeting to oppose it. Well, why? I wouldn't want to be seen as a racist, for opposing affirmative action. So that definitely exists. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's not the bigger part of the problem. I'm arguing the bigger part of the problem is this kind of left liberal set of moral intuitions, really, which is kind of can be summarized as majorities are bad and fearful, minorities are sympathetic, and we want to be on the side of the minority against the majority. So whatever the issue, whatever the proposal, the DEI proposal will always take the side of the minority against the majority. That kind of comes out of a makeup that's based on guilt among whites and perhaps men for what's happened in the past, combined with sympathy for minorities, women, perhaps sexual minorities as well. And then there's sort of what I call a fascist scare style fear of the majority, that they're always one step away from reinstituting Jim Crow segregation and putting gays in the closet and women back in the kitchen, and Nazism 1933 is just a sort of breath away. There's kind of scaremongering. If we talk about the left, there's an established literature around moral panicking about Red Scare. So this idea of a communist under every bed, them about to take over, that was there in the 20th century. The flip side of that for the left is this fascist scare that the fascists are about to take over and there's a fascist under the bed. That is actually accepted and promoted as a mainstream view and has been for many decades. And so these are all components of this kind of left liberal worldview, which is a set of fuzzy moral intuitions. It is not, and it is often based on these very pungent kind of narratives: slavery, Holocaust, Jim Crow, gays in the closet, these sort of very, the Black Civil Rights Movement being another one, very powerful images, stories. That's what anchors the emotions behind this. And so I put a lot of emphasis on the emotional landscape that has been created by left liberalism, and particularly these taboos and narratives. And that's what gives it such an advantage, really, in the public square in terms of moral emotions.
Yes, so strong, true belief there. And I think one of the points you make in the book is that while a lot of people like to talk about the supply side of these intellectual ideas, actually it's often better to focus on the demand side and sort of where, what's the background of kind of moral ideas, moral thinking, moral intuitions that all of this kind of stuff is coming from. So I was wondering if you had a sort of slightly deeper sense of all that, and where these moral intuitions are flowing from, and whether you'd agree with someone like Tom Holland, for instance, who would say that part of the reason we're so prone to accept woke ideas is that they're sort of deeply embedded ideas about equality and so on that are kind of embedded in our worldview because of our Christian past.
Yeah, I would agree very much with that. So I think these are slow outgrowths and outworkings of this kind of logic that does, yes, like Nietzsche and Tom Holland would suggest, the roots are Christian. And if you go to, this is the thing, if you look at Marxists, Karl Marx was very critical of this kind of humanitarianism. And it's very interesting to read in the Communist Manifesto what he's saying about the humanitarian reformers. He's very scathing and arguing that these people are kind of, naive idealists. I think that kind of utopian socialism, which had a strong humanitarian streak, and then subsequently the kind of humanitarian liberalism of as we get into the 20th century. Yeah, they all have roots to some degree in offshoots of Christianity, whether that be Christian socialism or the kind of Victorian humanism, which comes out of a certain version of Protestantism and eventually flowers as the liberal progressive movement in the first decade of the 20th century. People like John Dewey and Jane Addams, and the ecumenical movement of the period starting in the 1910s. That is really all about this very humanitarian interpretation of Christianity or post-Christianity. And that's where a lot of this begins. And now initially the people they felt sorry for were the European immigrant groups. That then after the 60s becomes focused much more on the non-European groups, particularly Black Americans, Indigenous, etc. So there were blind spots initially, but then there are new targets that become the favored groups that left liberalism focuses on. But yeah, that humanitarian streak kind of arises out of Christianity in a way, but it goes through a whole bunch of different post-Christian iterations. But I think that's where the spirit of it ultimately begins, yes. So I'd agree with that. Now, obviously, there are many different strands of Christianity, and there are certainly some very austere and hard strands as well. But this kind of humanitarian, the meek shall inherit the earth kind of strand is the one that I think has been developed by Christian socialism and then later by liberal humanitarianism. And that kind of builds, the logic of it unfolds, it then becomes the basis for kind of pluralist multiculturalism starting in the 20s and 30s and especially expanding through. And then as we get into the 60s, yes, the radicals, the revolutionary Marcuse, C. Wright Mills style left is important in terms of the vocabulary. But again, the support for this, you look at affirmative action, that has nothing to do with the post-Marxist left. You look at speech codes, you look at disparate impact doctrine, indirect discrimination, all these kinds of doctrines about equality, doctrines about hypersensitivity, racial diversity training. That's not coming from cultural Marxism. Certainly, and it's rising in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So again, that's just my point, is that already we had a pretty strong foundation based on this idea of, of course we should have equal outcomes between white and black and men and women. Of course we should be super, super, super sensitive about how we speak to these groups. That was already current, and it was already partly enshrined in law well before the sort of great awakening of the 2010s.
Okay, so that's given us a great theoretical understanding of woke, I think. But obviously, you wouldn't be writing about it if it wasn't, a political phenomenon, if it didn't impact politics. Now, many people are saying this is the immigration election, and you've talked about, excuse me, how woke, has a big influence on the immigration debate. And so there's, I think, a really interesting bit in the book early on where you're describing how the woke taboo, or the race taboo in particular, influenced the immigration debate in Britain going back all the way to the 60s. So there was in 1961, there was a law brought in to restrict immigration from the Commonwealth and say that we could only have it mostly from Ireland. And this was attacked by lots of left-wingers as a colour bar, entrenching a colour bar. And even though in the end, under Harold Wilson in 1965, they didn't overturn this, the only argument they could use to do that were sort of electoral arguments and sort of arguments about social cohesion, but they couldn't really answer the very morally charged argument that these moral entrepreneurs, I think you call them, were making. And you say that they sort of won the cultural battle, even though they lost the political battle on that particular policy. And so if we fast forward, there's another anecdote in White Shift, which I think runs along similar lines that this reminded me of, and that's a focus group that happens in 2014, I think that you did. And there's an elderly white lady from, I think, South London, and she is, I think the focus group is about immigration, and she describes going onto a bus, or maybe I think it's a tram actually, and saying, she felt very uncomfortable because there were no English people there. She felt like it wasn't England. And as soon as someone challenges her on that and says, well, why is that a problem? She gets defensive and then says, and then she starts talking about basically the material effects of immigration. She says, well, my grandchildren won't be able to get a job. What about GP appointments and things like this? And so to bring this all the way back to the current election, obviously, it's the Reform Party that's trying to make this the immigration election, and this is sort of Nigel Farage's, his issue. But I think, isn't it interesting that when most of the time when he's supposed to be this populist right figure, but when he is talking about immigration as well in this election, he is mostly focusing it on the material concerns. So he's talking about GP appointments, he's talking about the population explosion, he's talking about traffic on roads, and house prices and things like this. So it's almost as if this taboo, is still informing, heavily our discussion on this, even 60 years later. And it just, isn't that very interesting?
Yeah, that's really an interesting observation. And so there's an important connection here, and that is that woke is not just we don't just have a culture war in the media and in the universities taking place in a bubble, and not connected to the issues that are deciding elections. The fact that you have speech restrictions caused by the taboos, which, as I said, date back to the 60s. So, and that's the origins of woke. And so woke is not something that's just popped up in the 2010s. It's organically connected to the earlier wave, which has been called political correctness, multiculturalism, etc. So you've had these taboos for a long time. They have structured the parameters of the immigration debate and other debates. So one of the points I make in one of the later chapters of the book is that there are a whole set of these downstream effects of woke. We can't have a conversation about immigration. We can't have a conversation about crime. We can't have a conversation about incarceration, about exclusion from class when there are racial disparities in who gets excluded or incarcerated or who is restricted from entering the country in terms of immigration. And so all of these other debates are polluted by by woke and these taboos. And so that's perhaps where the big impacts are being felt. And by the way, also there are other impacts. If you don't have a patriotic enough population to provide soldiers for a voluntary military or for the police force, you are going to have a problem in foreign policy and in policing. So there are a whole bunch of sort of downstream effects of woke, and this is one of them, immigration. Because of the race taboo, mainstream parties for a long time, have not been able to talk about immigration. Even where they have talked about immigration, they have to couch it in the kinds of materialist terms you mentioned: pressure on jobs, public services, and so on. Nigel Farage feels is bound by that, and I think to a large extent, even Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National, I mean, they can talk about Islam, and that perhaps is breaking a taboo in a way, but to talk about ethnic change is something that has been left to Eric Zemmour and perhaps Thierry Baudet and a few others. But generally, the big populist right parties have not gone there explicitly. And actually, because really what we're talking about here is people being attached to a particular ethnic composition or their own particular group rather than feeling negatively about other groups. So it would be different if this woman was saying, I can't stand the way they look and smell. That would be racism. That's clearly something that's legitimate to have a taboo or at least a strong norm against. But to say I miss something, I'm attached to a particular way of life, ethnic composition, I don't like the speed of change, that is actually a different psychological orientation that's been shown in study after study after study. It's not the same as, dislike of others and liking of your own are two separate dispositions. It's impossible to have that conversation nowadays because of this taboo. And so what the taboo does is it just it takes more topics off the table of democratic discussion. It narrows the Overton window of acceptable debate. And what that does is it opens up space for people who are willing to violate the taboos, which typically has been populist entrepreneurs, Sweden Democrats, AFD. Just to take a couple of examples, Donald Trump, because the mainstream has been boxed in by these increasingly tight, narrowing taboos of narrowing the Overton window, that means there's more space for the populist to. Without those taboos, without woke, what I would call woke and its origins, there would be no populism because the mainstream parties would be on top of these issues. I'm not saying there would be none, but the mainstream parties would be talking about these issues pretty openly, even if they say, well, we have to balance different interests, so we can't go all the way but that you may want us to go. But it would be a much more open conversation, whereas the fact that it is a suppressed conversation, I think, is what contributes a lot of the energy to populist movements on the right.
Yeah. And so another example of this, so Liz Truss has recently been doing her media rounds for her book, and she's billed herself as this very kind of outspoken conservative. And at one point she was being interviewed by Stephen Edgington, and he asked her, admittedly in quite a blunt way, is she concerned about the white population of Britain diminishing? And he cites the 2001 census and the 2021 census. And she sort of immediately says, oh, no, I don't care about that at all. I'm colorblind. That's not a concern at all for me. And similarly, he's had the same answer to that question from Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, isn't that strange? Because, I mean, this is a big change, and this is something that, you could legitimately be concerned about as a conservative-minded politician, right? So why do they feel so, unwilling to talk about this kind of thing and unable?
So, this flags a couple of things. First, the anti-racism taboo we just talked about, which has been powerful since the mid-'60s. Certainly in Britain, in elite circles, didn't come in actually in the mass of the population till we hit the late 70s or into the 80s, actually. The other thing, of course, part of it is that understanding the difference, the subtle difference between disliking the outsider and liking your own group, liking a particular, being attached to a traditional ethnic composition, not wanting that to change. A lot of people are the left has been essentially dishonest about this and tried to include that difference to pretend like they're the same thing when, again, in the psychological research, they are very different dispositions. And I know you and I have probably talked about this, but just for the listeners, if you take the American National Election Study asks a question about how warm or cool do you feel towards different groups on a 0 to 100 thermometer. And if you are a white American and you feel warmer towards white people, actually you feel slightly warmer towards Black and Hispanic people as well. Whereas if you feel warm towards the Republicans and you're a Republican, you feel cooler towards Democrats. That's a zero-sum relationship, but on the race stuff, there is no zero-sum relationship. And that's pretty typical of what we see except where two groups are at war or in some kind of violent conflict. There just isn't that relationship. So people can be, very non-racist and yet very attached to a particular ethnic composition. And the other part of this, of course, is there's a lot of minority voters who are attached to a particular ethnic composition, and I've shown that in the book White Shift. So you can look at Hispanic Trump voters, you can look at Sikh and Hindu conservative voters in this country as well. That nuance is just impossible to bring out because, first of all, the politicians don't know those arguments there, but secondly, they're sort of so petrified by the idea that their reputation is going to be over if they're to be tarred by the other side as some kind of a racist. So how do we get to this more nuanced conversation about, in a way, ethnic conservatism that is not about ethnic purity and ethno-nationalism? I mean, what I call ethno-traditional nationalism, but that's a prime example of what you can't talk about. It's just too difficult, and politicians run from it. Again, I think part of it is that they don't know the arguments, but also that the taboos are just very strong.
Yeah, I mean, because you could imagine a quite conciliatory way of talking about it, right? But okay, let's move on. So one of the points you make in your book is about the much more culturally socialist, as you would describe it, attitudes of the younger generations, and the quite alarming trends that we've seen in that regard. Could you just set that out for us to begin with?
Well, yeah. I mean, so again, those who say woke is fading, it's just a temporary blip, and it's gone because DEI is in retreat in tech firms, and we've had some legislation around gender, single-sex spaces. I think that's very naive. And if you look at, because if we were to compare the end of McCarthyism in 1953 with sort of the current retreat from the high watermark of the George Floyd moment in 2020, the difference is that public opinion amongst young Americans in 1953 would have been more liberal than their elders. So would actually have been moving in the direction against McCarthyism. Whereas what we have now is, yes, there is amongst senior liberals at the New York Times, maybe at the Washington Post, they've done an editorial against mandatory diversity statements. And that's great that those senior liberals have rowed back on this stuff. But if you look at the generational turnover effects, they're just very striking. And I don't know if you saw this survey that Unheard released, Israel should not exist. Do you agree or disagree? Among the under 25s, it was like 55% agreed with that statement, 22% maybe disagreed. That's where we are. Now you take another question like, should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publishers? The under 25s are split on that evenly down the middle, whereas anyone over 45, it's low single-digit support for canceling Rowling. So the age gradation on that is really striking. And question after question after question looks like that. Should James Damore have been fired by Google for circulating that internal memo on the firm's gender policy? And there you saw 2/3 of the under 25s in both Britain and America that I've surveyed in support of Google, this big multinational, firing this programmer, compared to sort of a quarter to a third amongst the over 50s in both countries. You see this even within academia, young academics just far more censorious, far more intolerant than older academics, and that is within the left. So young left, over twice as intolerant as the old left. And that's kind of the problem there's a large literature on how people's brains sort of cease to develop in terms of synapses after their early 20s. So a lot of beliefs, tastes tend to crystallize in the early 20s and are carried through across the life course. And I just think that it's naive for us to believe that somehow this generation is going to grow out of its woke beliefs as it gets older, as they acquire homes and get married. I don't honestly believe there's going to be much change. There will be some change, but I don't think there will be a large amount of change. Where, there may be a change in terms of you getting a house and having more of an investment in the capitalist economy, and therefore voting for a right of center party for purely selfish, self-interested reasons. But in terms of those core moral intuitions and cultural attitudes, I think those are fairly set. Not entirely. Now, there is a scenario in which, one of the things we notice is that young population has, perhaps these views are not strongly held. A lot of young people don't vote, evince low interest in politics, and in survey experiments, you can shift their attitudes as 10 to 15 points. So I definitely think there is a possible flexibility if there is a massive society-wide move against woke in the future. I do think that Zoomers will be part of that movement, just as they've been part of that movement to some degree against the sort of gender-affirming position, and also in favor, by the way, of things like gay rights. So there has been I'm not saying it's completely set in stone, but I think that all other things being equal, in 20 years, when the median corporate leader and the median voter is a Zoomer, I think we're going to be in a much less liberal place in terms of free speech.
Okay, yes. So in your statistical analysis, you have heavily documented the more culturally socialist or woke attitudes of the younger generation. But running a bit counter to that is the fact that we've seen the European elections recently. Younger voters are voting heavily for the right populist parties. So the AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France, and the 18 to 24 demographic for males in particular is a very strong one for reform in the UK. And on top of this, there's this even, alongside it at least, there's this phenomenon of, you may have seen on social media recently, of European Zoomers chanting anti-immigration lyrics to techno dance songs, mostly on TikTok. Okay, which is quite a surprising phenomenon if we're told that all the younger generations are supposed to be getting more liberal over time. But does this sort of and some people talk about this as the rise of the Zoomer right, and does this not sort of run a bit counter to your stats here?
Yeah. So very interesting, and there are different trends to some degree in continental Europe versus the UK. The UK has the most left-wing young population. There's no question about that, even in comparison to other Anglo countries. And there are a number of reasons for that. The other thing we should bear in mind is that both young people and males are more likely to vote for so-called extreme parties, or at least for third parties, than are women or older voters. And so part of what's happening here is within the left bloc, young people are gravitating more to green or far left, and within the right bloc, they gravitate more to sort of populist right rather than mainstream right. The older voters, particularly who grew up at a time when there was less electoral volatility, have these sort of deep party attachments to the mainstream, either Christian Democrat Party or Social Democrat parties. But younger people are much more willing to switch and drop and change. And they tend to go towards more radical parties. We've seen that even in a situation like Northern Ireland, where support for the Democratic Unionist Party was higher amongst young voters compared to the mainstream UUP, and also support for Sinn Féin as opposed to the mainstream SDLP, again reflecting that phenomenon. So the question I guess I would have is, if we look at the left-right balance within the young population, is it that different? It may be that it's not that different in many countries. And it's just that within the left bloc, young people are going more towards the extreme, and within the right bloc, they're going more towards the populist extreme as well. I would suspect that's a big part of it. And there's also, by the way, more polarization among young people on these culture war questions than amongst older people. So young people are more kind of extreme in their views, whichever way we're going to take it. I think that explains a lot of it. Now, you can see interesting things. There's no question the Tories have been in power a long time. There was Brexit, which a lot of young people have interpreted as sort of something that is narrowing their range of possibilities, perhaps, to live and work. Those are unique factors to the British experience. If you go to Canada, for example, where the Liberal Party, a left-of-centre party, has been in power for 8 years, what you see is that young people are not more to the left compared to older people. In the US case, there's a lot of variability. I think it's somewhere in between Britain and Canada, although some of the polls recently are putting young people as a lot more, even if they're still slightly more pro-Biden than pro-Trump, the gap is nowhere near as large as one might have imagined. So all that is a long way of sort of suggesting that the picture does partly depend on the country. In Britain, there is the British young population is the most left-wing of any that I've seen, and there's the biggest age gap. And I think that's partly to do with Brexit and the 14 years in office of the Tories. Oh, I should say one other thing, which is, of course, there is this growing youth gender gap, that is something we see, at least in all Anglo countries. So women are just far more left-leaning than men are in the under 25, even the under 30 group. I mean, in Canada, there's like 25 points difference, so it's really staggering.
Right, yeah, okay. So we've spoken about the culture war and how that's influencing electoral politics. Obviously, one big influence on woke is the government of the day. And of course, in the past 14 years, we've had a conservative government which has sort of been, limply resistant to certain elements of the, advance of woke. But, probably by the time this goes out, we will be under a Labour government. So what's your sense of how, the culture war will play out under potential Keir Starmer as Prime Minister?
Well, my sense is that a lot of that woke will expand its reach, consolidate its reach more under Labour. Now, of course, under the Tories didn't do very much about what's being taught in schools. They did very little about...
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.